Thank you. I ask unanimous consent to authorize the chair to declare recess during the hearing. And without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, all of you who are out there remotely, please keep your microphone muted or I'll be yelling at you. To insert a document in the record, please email it to documentstni@mail.sk.gov. With that, I'm going to give a brief opening statement. I want to thank the Secretary for being here today. We're holding this hearing to do some oversight on the implementation of the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. And I appreciate you being here today to tell us about the progress. This may be a long day, and I appreciate the fact that you're going to make time available in the hope that all members who have questions will have an opportunity. So we're going to move along quickly, and we're going to strictly observe time limits so that we can move through this with as many members participating as possible. I really appreciate the fact that the IIJA money is getting out the door at a record pace. I mean, this is something that I've been looking forward to and working on since Obama was president, when I passed a bill out of subcommittee to increase spending by $350 billion, which at that time seemed like a phenomenal amount. And obviously, this one is $660 billion. Finally, after 12 years, we've got that. And, this is larger than anything else the department has ever had to deal with before. And as I understand it, you've, so far apportioned $75 billion in highway, transit, and airport formula funds, issued notices of funding opportunity for tens of billions more through 22 competitive grant programs. This is absolutely unprecedented in terms of the investments we're making and the pace at which we're putting this money out. The stakes are high. We want to get this money out. Inflation is eating into what we're going to be able to build, and the more quickly we can commit the funds, the more we will get done. And I expect that we'll hear some criticism from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But, sadly, almost none of them here today or on this committee voted for this legislation, which was amazing to me at the time of passage. I know Donald Trump didn't like it because he couldn't do it. And this actually got done. But it is a record amount of long overdue investment. And we aren't just, as I said before, I'm pleased we're not just trying to do Eisenhower 8.0. At the same time, you're looking at, you have guidance on Fix It First, something that was stripped out by the Senate. The 10 members of the Senate, 10 Republicans and 2 Democrats, none of whom have a major role on any of the 3 committees of jurisdiction in the Senate who wrote this bill. They used our template in terms of money and more routine things, but they bristled at the idea that we would deal meaningfully with climate change and look at alternatives to just an infinite amount of highway building, which will not solve our problems. As we all know, there's something called induced demand. And I talked a lot about the Virginia Railway as opposed to expanding 95 South, and I was hoping that, and I'm hoping states will replicate that around the country, where we can reduce carbon pollution, move people more efficiently, and look toward a 21st century system in this country. I appreciate the fact that you're encouraging the states. You're not mandating or penalizing them. You're not taking away decision-making authority, but we're just asking them, and I've spoken to the Association of State Highway Officials about this, just take a look at this. Fix it first, do the critical maintenance we need to do, and then secondly, look, when you're having a congestion problem, look and see what is the best solution. Is it, attempt to build more highway miles, or is there a way to move the people more efficiently? I also appreciate the fact that, I'll be sending you a letter soon to, support your efforts to require measurement and reduction of greenhouse gases. Transportation is our single largest source of carbon pollution, and we do need to address that. So with that said, I would now yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Since you last testified before the committee, Congress did pass the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, and although many members on my side of the aisle voted against it, mostly because there was no Republican input, and then ultimately no House input in the bill. Having said that, I do recognize it is now the law of the land, and I respect that fact. My focus now is going to be on oversight of the law and ensuring that it's implemented efficiently, effectively, and adheres to the letter of the law. And why is this important? Because our nation is dealing with crisis after crisis, from a spending crisis to an energy crisis. We have a supply chain crisis, a workforce shortage crisis, and all of these problems are feeding into an historic inflation crisis. And it's astounding that inflation has increased 550%. Americans know that they can no longer buy the same amount of food or gasoline or other necessities with their hard-earned dollars as they could just a year and a half ago. Obviously not by a long shot. And the same holds true for our infrastructure dollars. Committee Republicans heard some pretty grim warnings last week during our roundtable on inflation. Companies working in the transportation space are struggling with exploding costs across the board. And some of these companies can't shoulder the risk of inflation, which means some of the businesses, especially smaller ones, are unable to even bid on some of the jobs. At the same time, states are running over their transportation budgets as they have the impossible task of estimating project costs, which are going to continue to increase exponentially. In my home state of Missouri, they're estimating that they're going to go $140 million over budget in their current year's transportation plan. States are also receiving fewer and fewer bids on their projects. With all the regulatory red tape, they aren't able to get through the process in time for a company's proposal to stay true to their original estimated costs. And that's why it's incumbent upon the Department and Congress to make sure that every single dollar from the law counts and is directed towards projects safely and efficiently to move people, to move goods, and clear the bottlenecks that are adding to the supply chain crisis. However, many stakeholders have already expressed concerns about the administration's implementation of the infrastructure law, and I share some of those concerns. Just to highlight a few, one of the concerns to me and many others is that December 16th of last year, the Federal Highway Administration guidance memo. Mr. Secretary, I know that you've spoken about some of the concerns raised since this guidance was issued, but I hope you recognize the fact that it remains a serious source of concern and confusion because it pushes the administration's own priorities, including a bias towards adding new highway capacity over what's written in the law itself. Another related concern I have is the number of the department's competitive grant notices that also include language doubling down on the federal highway guidance. The notices for grant programs like the infra grants, RAISE, the mega grants, rural, and the reconnecting communities, they all clearly show that the administration isn't as laser focused as it needs to be on fundamental transportation policy and projects that actually improve mobility. One additional concern I want to highlight is in regard to the one federal decision provisions which were included in the law and are critical to cutting the red tape for so many of the projects. Instead of simply implementing the OFD provisions, the administration released its action plan on project permitting on May 11th, and it doesn't seem to mention OFD. So again, here's another example of the law laying out an explicit policy which the administration appears to be ignoring in favor of accelerating projects to fit its own agenda. The result of the administration putting its agenda ahead of the law of the land, and even acting in contradiction to the law in some cases, is the infrastructure funding. Already, it's dramatically devalued by this crippling inflation, as has been pointed out, and is being diluted even further. This is not shaping up to be the infrastructure bill that Americans were promised. And now more than ever, this administration needs to focus on real infrastructure and on policies that can get us out of so many of these crises. So with that, I do want to thank the chairman again for holding this hearing, and thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I know you were busy, but coming before Congress, it does mean a lot to a lot of members. Thanks.
Thank the ranking member. Now I'd like to formally recognize the Honorable Pete Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation. Thanks again for joining us today. Look forward to your testimony. And without objection, our witness's full statement will be included in the record. And since your written testimony has been a part of the record, the committee requests that you limit your initial remarks to 5 minutes. With that, you may proceed.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Chair DeFazio. Thank you, Ranking Member Graves, and thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to join you this morning. Before I begin, I want in particular to recognize you, Chair DeFazio, for 36 years of extraordinary service and to congratulate you on your upcoming retirement. There are few who can claim to have done more than you to champion safety, to promote environmental justice, and to advance transportation systems to benefit all Americans. I also want to acknowledge that earlier this year we lost a member and former chair of this committee, the late Representative Don Young, who represented the people of Alaska for nearly half a century, and was often willing to cross the aisle to get things done for the American people. Thanks to leaders like Chair DeFazio, Representative Young, and so many of you, we now have the most transformative transportation investment in most of our lifetimes in the form of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And it couldn't have come at a more important time. From delays at ports to freight congestion to shortages in aviation, American transportation has rarely confronted this many intersecting challenges at once, both immediate and entrenched. Nearly 43,000 people died in traffic crashes last year, each of them a parent or child, colleague or friend. Transportation produces more carbon emissions than any other sector at a time when the nations of the world are rallying to confront the climate challenge. And as Americans grapple with the effects of inflation, we know that transportation is the second largest household expense after housing, affecting every family budget. This is also, though, a moment of enormous opportunity, with reason for optimism. Thanks to the infrastructure law, my department has never seen a moment of greater potential than now to build transportation resources that connect everyone safely, efficiently, and affordably to the things we need and the people we love. Needless to say, we've been busy. We've already announced nearly $84 billion in grant funding from across the department. Every few days, we have another great announcement. Bridge repair programs that'll help us move more goods more affordably and people more safely. A national electric vehicle charging network with the potential to bring cost-saving technology to rural communities and help fight the climate crisis. And safety initiatives that will reduce crashes and save lives. For example, getting rid of outdated railroad crossings to prevent tragedies like the one we saw recently in Sheridan County. Ranking Member Graves, my thoughts are with all of your constituents, the passengers, the families who were impacted by that derailment. And I want to emphasize that DOT will continue to support NTSB's investigation and work to improve railroad safety nationwide. From safety to reliability to affordability, name a dimension of transportation that you deal with in daily life, we have a program addressing it. All of this is going to help people get where they need to go while creating jobs and economic opportunity across the country. You all know better than anyone that passing the law is only the first step. Success means delivering good projects that improve the lives of your constituents. I'll give you just a few examples of the work we're supporting. Alpena, Michigan is a community of fewer than 10,000 people where one of the largest employers is the local cement plant. We awarded the city funding to modernize their port so it can bring in larger cargo ships. That means more business for the plant, more jobs for the people of Alpena, and better access to materials for manufacturers across the region. Within the city limits of Baltimore, it can take hours to get from home to work if you don't have a car. So we're funding 10 new miles of dedicated bus lanes to connect residential neighborhoods with major employers in a single corridor that supports more than 180,000 jobs. In 2007, Findlay, Ohio, a town of 40,000, flooded. Hundreds of homes and businesses were damaged or forced to move. Now, we're helping Findlay replace a century-old railroad bridge with a modern ballast deck bridge that will not only help people get to work, but also reduce the risk of flooding damage in the future. And these are just a sample from among literally thousands of projects that will help Americans live and work where they want, help businesses deliver better products, and help families save for the future. They can even save lives. In this good work, we will need your continued leadership and partnership, as well as that of communities across the country, organized labor, businesses, state, tribal, and local officials, and so many more. Together, we have the opportunity to improve countless lives, support good-paying jobs, strengthen America's manufacturers, modernize our infrastructure for decades to come, and cement America's position as the world's leading economy. So thank you once more for inviting me to be here today, and I'm looking forward to addressing your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I will now move on to questions. I'll first recognize the chair of the Surface Transportation Subcommittee, Eleanor Holmes Norton, for her questions. Eleanor will be virtual.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Buttigieg, for being here today. As you know, the Department of Transportation grant recipients have historically been prohibited, from utilizing geographic or economic or other hiring preferences regarding the use of labor on DOT-funded transportation projects. But the new infrastructure law provided new statutory authority for recipients of DOT grants to utilize local labor hiring preferences. And we call them local hires on construction contracts. I do support this authority. As a former mayor yourself, can you explain what this new authority means for cities and other grant recipients carrying out infrastructure projects? For example, are grant recipients required to utilize local hiring preferences?
Well, thank you very much. As both secretary and as mayor, I've heard too often stories from neighborhoods that have long craved some kind of infrastructure investment finally see it, only for residents to look at the work site and wonder if any of the people getting the good paying jobs working on that project come from anywhere near the area where the project is being done. But as you mentioned earlier, our ability to support that kind of work was restricted to pilot programs. Using the authority provided for us in the new law, we will be able to support local hiring provisions to the extent they are supported on the ground in ways that we think are going to contribute enormously to opportunity in communities that perhaps in the past have been left out of the good paying job creation and the ladders to the middle class that come with it. And so we will continue using the authorities provided in the law to support that kind of work and support that extension of access to opportunity for so many who have not felt that they've been part of it in administrations or in years past.
So that they can use local hiring preferences. Are they required to use local hiring preferences?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Are grant recipients required to utilize local hiring preferences?
So we encourage local hire. It depends, of course, on the program, but federal aid highway programming now paves the way for grant recipients to do so, and we'll be working with them every step of the way.
Okay, I'll be encouraging my transportation authority to require local hiring preferences where I'd like to ask you about Union Station here in the District of Columbia. The Federal Railroad Administration recently revised its proposal to develop Union Station. I appreciate the renewed focus on better serving transit, rail, and bus riders, along with cyclists that are provided in this proposal. But it's also critical to ensure that Union Station design works for DC residents who rely on local transit, food, and retail options, and who will be impacted on a daily basis by changes in traffic patterns in the area. What is your department doing to engage with local residents about the project and to account for their needs and suggestions going forward?
Well, as your question importantly notes, there are many modes of transportation that converge at Union Station. And while it is certainly known partly for its role in intercity rail and longer distance travel, it's also very significant as a hub for transit and as a retail site that's very meaningful for the immediate neighborhood, both in terms of access to retail and in terms of access to jobs. So we consider it very important, as we would in any project, but certainly with all of the overlapping equities here, for the voices of community members to be heard. I know that's expressed partly through you and through your office, but also expect for there to be immediate means of input. And we'll work with the project sponsor, and knowing that the District of Columbia, of course, is very hands-on with this, to make sure that we support that kind of participation and that all those relevant concerns are heard.
Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady, and now turn to Ranking Member Sam Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is actually fairly simple, because one of the things I'm concerned about and been pretty active in over the years is trying to figure out how we make the Highway Trust Fund solvent. We've obviously got a lot of vehicles on the road that aren't paying for the use of the road. You know, and again, it's something I've been pretty active in, and I know there was a alternative funding board, I think, that was put in the infrastructure plan. I'm just curious if how that's coming along, and I know we had some pilot projects going on out there too, some VMT pilot projects and a few things. I don't know. We're not talking about that anymore, and I know it's a monumental task when it's eventually going to have to be tackled to figure that out. But just curious on your thoughts and where we are in that process and how those pilots are going.
Thank you. Yes, there were the pilots that were authorized previously through the FAST Act. A number of states have pursued them, and we're always interested in their experience and trying to get information about the results there. Further pilots are provided for in the IAJA, and we'll support that work as well. I think ultimately there are some profound policy considerations that'll need to be addressed in terms of the long-term viability of the Highway Trust Fund. And as you know, for the IAJA, it was very important to this administration not to take any step that would be inconsistent with the president's commitment not to raise taxes on anybody making less than $400,000 a year. But in some way, shape, or form, we need to be prepared for a model of sustainable highway trust funding that is different from the one that we've inherited. And as these pilots continue to take shape, and we can update your office on the federal kind of side in terms of how we're laying the groundwork for that pursuant to IAJA, I think it'll give us some important data points that we're going to need, especially if Congress decides for the long run that it's not as prepared as it has been in the past to commit general fund dollars for that purpose.
And we're going to continue to pull general fund dollars in, and I worry about that. You know, the precedent that it sets. In transportation, we've always tried to be a pay-as-you-go and a fee-based process, and I'm concerned about just the movement away from that. But it is a concern. Thanks. I yield back.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Now, Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson. Eddie B.
Yes, thank you very much. And let me thank the Secretary for making himself available and for the job he's doing on behalf of the administration. And I want to thank you for visiting Dallas Fort Worth, but you only saw 2 programs, so I hope you'll be coming back soon. it's critically important to make sure that everyone is benefiting from this legislation. So could you discuss what the federal DOT is doing to ensure that disadvantaged business programs are working properly and are guaranteeing the minority and women-owned businesses are getting a fair share of these transportation dollars?
Thank you for the question. This is very important to us. It is, of course, the rationale for the DBE programs that are provided for in the law, and also just an essential matter of fairness in terms of the business opportunity that parallels, in my view, the need for fairness in labor opportunity that was at stake in the question that Representative Norton asked earlier. In order to make good on that, we have been actively working not just to ensure that there is compliance with the DBE law, but in order to make sure that we are better alerting the DBE community to the business opportunities that it might create. For example, our Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization has been preparing events around the country to help bring together officials and contractors to preview the opportunities and get a better sense of how to compete for those opportunities. We know
The
that
gentleman
there
would
needs to be-
suspend for 1 second. I believe someone's microphone's on, and I believe it might be Eleanor Holmes Norton. Please mute your microphones. Continue, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. We recognize that our processes need to be user-friendly, especially if we are trying to expand the base of historically excluded business owners who have access to these federal opportunities. And so we will be working with the states, the transit agencies, and others who are being funded, while also making sure that we meet our own ambitious goals for direct federal procurement, which have been increased this year on the SDB side to 20%, and making sure that we're meeting our goals in-house, I think, will also give us important expertise and experience, which will be relevant for us to work with the states and the other partners on for the effective inclusion of various businesses and opportunities created by the bill writ large.
Well, thank you very much. Now, I know that this is not important to a lot of people, but cities that were impacted by highways and disadvantaged communities are really concerned about it. It's a small amount of money as we look at the country, but I'm hoping that we will provide some robust funding for reconnected communities. I know that in my district, in Dallas, Texas, right in the downtown areas, we have at least 2 major areas. And so I'm hoping that there will be some attention given to those important reconnections.
Well, thank you. We had the great pleasure of rolling out the Reconnecting Communities program recently in Birmingham, and have seen just enormous interest around the country in knitting together places that have been separated or divided by a piece of infrastructure, be it a railway, a highway, an interchange, or something else. I think that we'll learn a great deal through this first ever round of applications coming in, and we recognize that the program will very likely be oversubscribed, that we'll get more than $200 million worth of applications this first year, but also hope in the work that we will be able to fund to light the way for what jurisdictions may be able to do with their own dollars, even if not earmarked for this purpose, knowing that that benefits the entire community with better transportation networks, while also addressing some of the harms that have been created by choices in the past.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I think my time is just about expired.
Okay, thank the gentlelady. Now, Representative Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Continuing on with that theme, you recently announced a $1 billion program aimed at combating alleged racism in road projects. At the same time, DOT is actively supporting the construction of the doomed California high-speed rail project, despite reports that indicate the project is in fact displacing and destroying low-income minority communities in the track's path. So my question is, why are you dismantling existing highways in the name of racial equity while you're also supporting a project that's actively harming low-income minority communities?
So every project has an impact, and what we think the law provides for is a process for local communities to weigh in on how those impacts affect them And unless there is a civil rights violation, in which case my department, of course, will very proactively address it, then it falls to the project sponsor to decide how to balance those concerns. But in terms of the highway work, the way I view it is, if federal dollars were ever used in a way that separates or segregates, then a pretty good use of federal dollars now would be to connect and to address those harms. And my view also is that the entire community, not just those who were disadvantaged, is better off when a community is served by transportation infrastructure that does in fact connect more than it divides.
Well, that sounds pretty good rhetorically, but in reality, what we know is that this money pit in California that's largely being subsidized by federal tax dollars is doing exactly what you purport to prevent with this $1 billion allocation. So I think that is worth revisiting at some point to determine if in fact certainly that's happening. Is that a good expenditure of money? But let me move on in the interest of time. Ranking Member Graves mentioned a 550% increase in inflation since your boss took office. That's wreaking havoc on our economy. It's destroying particularly transportation businesses. That includes the small suppliers and the disadvantaged business enterprises that work in that space. Companies just can't afford to cash flow this increased inflation and shoulder that risk. And what's worse is it's creating a vacuum in the marketplace that allows for foreign companies to come in and further decimate U.S. industries and economies. So my question is, can DOT provide guidance to states and other recipients that inflation adjustments are required in transportation contracts?
So cost containment is a major focus for us right now in implementing the law, because we're hearing this from both project sponsors and the business community. The impact of cost escalation and inflation is unquestionably going to affect our ability to deliver. I'm less sure that this is something that would put U.S. companies at a disadvantage to international companies, for the simple reason that inflation is international. I was just in Germany a few months ago. Inflation there is somewhere around 8 or 9%. So a German company, I imagine, would face the same kind of cost escalation.
With respect,
that a
I'm
US
less
company
concerned about a German company and more concerned about a Chinese company, which subsidize at a much, much higher rate than anybody else. And they do that obviously for reasons to disrupt our economy and to jeopardize our national security. So that's my focus there, is to make sure we're not creating an opportunity for Chinese SOEs to come in and occupy space that should be occupied by U.S. businesses, and particularly these DBEs that we're trying to ensure have an opportunity to perform in that marketplace. But let me move on. Has DOT performed a legal analysis to see what is possible?
To see what is possible to address inflation?
Sure.
Sure, we're looking at it every day. We don't need legal analysis to tell us that we've got to make sure that
I'm talking
there's
about the
access to-
contracting process.
You mean in terms of imposing a new requirement on the states?
Yes.
I have not addressed imposing additional requirements on the states for this purpose, but we could certainly look into that if you.
So what I'm asking is, for contract reviews to address inflation, has there been a legal analysis there? Because when this was implemented, and we've seen inflation continue on an upward trajectory, and there were no provisions offered to address that, and so we're seeing that it's very, very difficult for companies to maintain pace with this rate of inflation. And so I guess what I'm asking is, are contracts firm? Are they fixed? Or is there any provisions in place for them to address that inflation?
So often contracts will have a contingency factor that can affect any unanticipated pressure
In this
on
case,
prices.
do they have a contingency factor?
Again, it would depend on the specific program involved, but would certainly welcome a chance to work with your office to see if you agree that that's adequately contemplated in the contract framework.
And any other provisions being discussed about what can be done, for what DOT can do to help small businesses and DBEs continue to participate in this market?
A couple of things that we think can be helpful here. One, of course, is simply doing everything we can to ensure that projects move forward swiftly, right? The greater the rate of inflation, the greater the cost of delay. And so as we're looking at everything from technical assistance to support moving through the permitting process, that's something that becomes even more important in a high inflation environment. Other mechanisms that I think could make a difference here are ones that could look at the timing of the spikes that you see in the cost of some of the different inputs. Not that you can predict the divergence between, let's say, the cost of steel or the cost of labor 3 years from now, but there may be ways to help project sponsors like transit agencies or state highway departments at least map out where some of the bulges are likeliest to occur in the availability or the restriction of supply. And I think that could make a difference too. So that's an example of the kind of thing we're exploring with them as we partner to try to make sure we get the absolute most value for these taxpayer dollars.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. We now turn to Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, I have a very Washington State-focused question to start, and it has to do with culvert funding. We passed an $800 million program as part of the IIJA that included contributions from states, locals, and tribal governments to replace culverts. It's a big issue in our state, and when can we expect information about IIJA culvert funding program?
So we're hard at work on this. It is a new territory for us in many regards, so we've been working with interagency partners like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and others. I've told my team I'd like to see this guidance out by the time the salmon are finished running, and hopefully it'll be before the peak. So that's the best answer I can give you. Late summer is really
There may be no salmon running at all if we don't get the culvert funding out.
We're hard at work on it.
Yeah, I understand. I wanted to underline that for us in the Northwest. Thanks so much. Changing the direction a little bit, one aspect of the equity question. We've been exploring equity issues in my district and throughout the country, and there's a lot of variety in how people define equity and so on, but there are aspects of it. One issue has to do with equity and data collection. If we don't collect good data, then we don't really know specifically the impacts on some communities, make it impossible for DOT to factor that into community efforts to address inequities. So how have you used data collection for underrepresented groups, and how is that factored into the equity action plan in the DOT?
So what we're trying to do is strike the right balance between gathering enough data to set good policy and know how we're doing as far as the effects, benefits, and impacts of our policies and projects on disadvantaged communities, without creating such a burdensome framework for data collection that it's actually low-income communities or small rural communities, in other words, the ones we'd most want to help from an equity perspective, that find it prohibitive to apply for projects or to participate in our processes. I think that balance leaves room for us to gather data at a more granular level, though, and I think we have a responsibility to do that. We still have relatively little visibility, for example, on who gets the economic benefit of the dollars once they go out of our building, so to speak. And I think that, especially given what technology now makes possible in terms of managing this data, we're in a position to, in what I hope will be an administratively lightweight fashion, gather more information than we've ever had and use that for decision support.
There may be examples. Puget Sound Regional Council has a data tracker on equity that we can pass on to you. We're looking at. But related to this issue of equity and small rural communities, which I also represent, got a big variety in my district. And one of the challenges that they have, and we shared with Mayor Landrieu as well, is just the lack of capacity to apply for competitive grants. Competitive grants that are called rural transportation grants, and they just don't have the capacity to get their arms around that. Has the DOT thought through this problem? Because I know Mayor Landrieu has heard of this issue throughout the implementation phase.
Yes, two things were at least two things I can point to that we're doing about this. It resembles my own experience as a mayor who led a city that didn't necessarily have the resources for a robust federal affairs team, and there are communities much smaller than my hometown of South Bend trying to get access here. The first is to make the processes simpler on the front end. So when you see us taking a step like a combined notice of funding opportunity that rolls infra and mega and the rural surface transportation program into one, part of what we're trying to do is just have literally fewer pages of paper out there in the process so that it is easier to navigate for an applicant of any size. The second thing is to make sure that we're proactively engaging project sponsors or would-be project sponsors, and where possible, and we do have some funding for this, though there's always going to be more demand than we can support, the kind of direct technical assistance that can help walk them through the process, especially when you're looking at a first-time applicant.
Thanks. And then on workforce issues and equity, perhaps you touched on this with discussion on DBE, but and you have in some respects, but are there other steps that DOT is taking to ensure that minority-owned businesses are in fact considered for and selected for these projects?
Quite a few, and part of how I view this is that it's not only a matter of fairness, although that's reason enough, but also the volume and the pace of infrastructure work we're taking on as a country is going to demand everything that we can provide as a country as far as talent, entrepreneurial talent, and skilled work. And what that means is that we can't succeed if we leave any talent on the table. And so as you look across our programs, some of them can directly support workforce development in a way that we think benefits both labor and DBE ownership. Some of it doesn't require that, but certainly leaves space for project sponsors to do so. And the effects are
Can I stop you there? Because
compelling.
I want to respect the 5-minute rule, and before the chair makes me respect the 5-minute rule. But we'll follow up with your staff with the rest of the answer. Thanks.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Representative Gibbs.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, just to follow up a little bit on Congressman Crawford's questions. My understanding, the Federal Transit Authority recently put out guidance to at least one of their regional offices that suggests transit grants recipients through OMB regulations are allowed the federal resources to help cover material cost increases from previously negotiated contracts. Have similar memos gone out for highway and other offices?
I would have to get back to you on mode by mode how each of the different operating administrations is trying to accommodate those things that are taking place. But
You can concur that the Federal Transit Authority has done that?
I'll make sure, but I certainly don't know anything that would contradict that.
Okay, thank you. Also, do you agree that investing in federal port infrastructure dollars in improving efficiency, including automation and new technologies, would help improve port operations and relieve supply chain bottlenecks?
We strongly believe in funding port infrastructure that will make a positive difference to
Okay.
both the port's ability to move goods
Yeah.
and to the surrounding community.
Are you aware that there's currently restrictions on using federal dollars for these purposes, for automation and, basically automation infrastructure?
So as you likely know, there is a lot of difference of opinion and difference in the research on where automation in fact yields to productivity increases and where it doesn't. And there's quite a bit of skepticism about how that could work in the US context. That said, there are so many things that we can invest in and are investing in that unquestionably benefit the efficiency and the throughput of ports. For example, with the Port Infrastructure Development Program in the last round, we sent about $52 million to Long Beach. That's going to allow them to build about 10,000 additional feet of on-dock rail, which helps you without having to wait for a chassis or have the truck go between, get those containers on their way. And we're going to continue to look for ways to support throughput, again, hopefully in a fashion that also benefits the surrounding community.
Well, I would think, sometimes there's always some resistance to automation and new technologies because of labor issues and all that. And all you can think of it, if historically, where would we be in the agricultural community if we resisted automation? Where would we be if we protected the phone operators back in the 70s? The new technologies come about from that. So, I think historically, technology has maybe jobs have gone by the wayside, but then in addition, but the result is different new jobs, higher paying jobs for improving standard of living. So I think that's a thing to keep in the back of your head, that automation is sometimes tough, but it's usually, the correct way to go, at least historically and across many sectors of our economy. You may be aware that pipelines are one of the safest and most efficient environmentally way to transport energy. Yet I'm concerned that this administration's anti-energy agenda at the time when gas prices and inflation have reached all-time highs. Congress back in 2020 passed bipartisan legislation to boost pipeline safety and efficiency. Can you please provide us an update on the implementation of this law that was passed 22 years ago?
Thank you. PHMSA has been hard at work making sure that the provisions of the Pipes Act are enacted, both in terms of making sure that we have the right kind of staffing to support it and the rulemakings that are called for in the legislation. I would be happy to get you more details, but the bottom line is that we will continue to meet our safety mission. Whatever other policy questions are being debated, and PHMSA has taken a number of steps to, I believe, enhance, even just in the time that, since the legislation was passed, to enhance our already very strong track record in terms of safety oversight.
I realize in your purview, safety is in your jurisdiction, but I don't think there's been really any pipelines permitted in this administration. Might not come under your purview, might come under the Army Corps, the EPA, but restricting this pipeline permitting access to exploration in the United States is limiting our exploration and our ability to produce more energy, because if you don't have the pipelines to put the natural gas in, they can't produce the wells. And so I just make that comment. Also, the Maritime Administration permits for deep water ports, that's the only thing they have a granting permit for. There's been a release of environmental impact study. I understand the first release of the draft environmental impact study was to provide multiple language information in nearby communities, even though such information had already been provided part of the original DEIS. I guess this administration, if they meet all their permits, the applicant meet all the environmental requirements are met, will the Maritime Administration provide a positive record of a decision on this?
So once applicants have fully satisfied the requirements of the EIS, then the Deepwater port can be licensed. I can tell you in the last 3 years, MARAD's engaged over 20 companies with interest in developing new facilities, with 8 deepwater port export applications that came in during that time. I believe 2 of those were withdrawn, but the remaining 6 are under review, and we'll review them according to the responsibilities that MARAD has under the law.
I just hope they meet the requirements that are approved. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I would now turn to Representative Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for announcing the funding opportunity for the Railroad Crossing Elimination Program. Funding is incredibly important to my district, and the money for the Great Separations is significant, but just as significant is the effective coordination between government sponsors and the private railroad companies who can hold up these projects with excessive requirements, unnecessary private railroad improvements on taxpayer dime, and delays. How is the department ensuring that railroad companies and all stakeholders are effective partners to quickly implement railroad grade separation projects? Secondly, I greatly appreciate the administration's Justice 40 initiative that directs 40% of federal funds to disadvantaged communities. Is the Justice 40 initiative being implemented for all your grant programs, and in particular, your Transit Capital Investment Grant Program? And one more question, and very proud to have Foothill Transit in my district, leading the nation for more than a decade in electric and fuel zero emissions buses, and has invited you to visit the facilities. I extended the invitation to you personally in the letter that I just handed you. Since zero emissions buses are new technology, how is FTA working with experienced agencies like Foothill Transit to ensure information and best practices are shared amongst transit agencies as they receive infrastructure law funding for zero emission buses?
Thank you. I'll try to, let me try to take those in reverse order. So with regard to the zero emission buses, we recognize there are a lot of agencies like Foothill Transit that already have quite a bit of expertise in this regard, and we want to make sure that that's taken on board. So FTA is doing a lot of convening through efforts like the Transit Vehicle Innovation Deployment Centers Initiative to try to bring the different players together. And actually, I believe Foothill Transit was among the agencies on an advisory panel in a position to share their expertise on this, because we do need to make sure that more agencies understand and are equipped to take advantage of the funding and to make these clean vehicle deployments that are going to be so important for their future. With regard to Justice 40, I can tell you that the entire $20 billion per year programming of the FTA supports equity in transportation. And this can take different forms, and I think the formal criteria and guidance related to Justice 40 is still being framed up at the interagency level, but we're certainly not waiting to take actions that are going to meet those goals, knowing that so many of the communities that are overburdened and underserved are also those that stand to gain the most from having excellent, convenient, accessible, and clean transportation brought to them, and the economic opportunity that comes with it. And then on the rail grade crossings, this is an issue that we're hearing about from communities in every part of the country of every size. And we consider it very important, not only from a safety perspective, of course, but also as we discuss issues like more fluid movement of goods and cargo. This is certainly a concern because those at-grade crossings are associated with slow orders and other measures for safety purposes that wind up impacting the fluidity of the overall system. So we're very pleased to have now the dedicated railroad crossing elimination program, in addition to other rail funding like CRISI that can help in this regard. And FRA is very actively engaging all of the different players, communities, railroads, and any other interested stakeholders on how to make sure that, that this can be effectively used. It can be challenging because sometimes there is an infrastructure owner that is different than the project sponsor. You imagine a city coming to the table, wanting to get rid of an at-grade crossing, needing to engage with a railroad that actually has the asset. And so we're doing what we can to try to make sure that there's the right communication so that these applicants can be successful.
Thank you very much. The fact that the railroads have been good partners in my area, but they still don't provide the funding necessary to complete the project, or at least be a partner with the state and the Fed. And then on the grant program, how about the Transit Capital Investment Grant Program?
Sorry, what about the capital investment?
That was on the Justice 40.
Yes, so I can tell you that the whole intent of the transit programming writ large is, of course, to connect people to opportunity and to where they need to be. And the kinds of communities that Justice 40 is looking at are often those that stand to gain a great deal by the work that's being done in CIG. And so again, what I would emphasize is, even in those areas that may or may not fit the formal or technical definition of Justice 40, they will already, certainly CIG will already have criteria that are relevant to the spirit of that program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlelady. Now, Representative Webster.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary, for appearing. We really appreciate it. As you know, the revenue from the Highway Trust Fund is not sufficient to meet the transportation needs, and so over the years, since maybe 2007, 2008, we put money in, and that money is being spent, and it's going to be spent up again here in the next few years. We'll need to do it again. And the CBO estimates that it's maybe 2026 or 2027 we'll run out of money again. The administration, though, is focusing on promoting electric cars and has championed a gas tax holiday. Those are things that take away revenue, not add to it. So my question is, do you have something that wouldn't negatively affect revenue that we could kind of put our teeth into that would rebuild what's there, including maybe something that would tax electric vehicles?
So first, I do want to emphasize that when the President asked Congress to consider the gas tax holiday, he called for a means of doing it that would hold harmless the Highway Trust Fund. But certainly the larger point is well taken, that as we continue the transition toward electric vehicles and zero-emitting vehicles, it means that we're going to need to have other means for filling gaps in the Highway Trust Fund. Up until now, Congress has been prepared to do that through general fund transfers. That's certainly a legitimate way to fund our highway needs. It's not the only way, and it's not consistent with the past practice of a user pays principle. How to enact an alternative. These are the kinds of things that the FAST Act law provided for exploring in the pilots. Some states have begun doing that. And pursuant to IIJA, there can be more work in that regard, too. I think that will get us more technical insights, but I think ultimately this will be not a technical decision, but a policy one. And that largely comes down to whether Congress will continue to hold to the user pays principle or seek an alternative means for funding.
Have you considered some sort of toll facility which every vehicle would pay if they had to go through the toll booth? Is that something that's an option?
You know, I grew up in northern Indiana where 8090 is funded as a toll road, and certainly that's something I think we're accustomed to on certain heavily trafficked roads, especially if they were built or maintained with that in mind. I think it's tougher to imagine how that could be implemented on a widespread basis, and so unless we could think of a non-intrusive way to do that, I think it'll be always something that's restricted to more specific and high traffic points, bridges and certain highways, than something that could answer how the road system writ large is funded.
So how about using private money to do that?
Using highway money to erect the toll booths?
No,
or-
private money like.
Oh, sorry, I thought you
private
said
inve-
highway money.
Private investment.
We do think that there continues to be a place for private investment, if you look at some of the work our Build America Bureau has done to unlock some of that private value, it holds a lot of promise. I would be less confident that that could answer a question as large scale as how to keep the Highway Trust Fund in order.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Representative Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, I thank you for coming before the committee and for your introductory remarks recognizing the outstanding service of our chair, of our former chair, Mr. Young, who was a dear friend, and the work of this committee. Last time I think we spoke, you called me about supporting the bill from the Senate, and I told you I couldn't do it because I was supportive of my chairman and the hard work of this committee. Forget about all that. I voted for the bill. We had a hearing last week on highlighting the impact of outdated road design in the highway safety crisis. We learned the speed is a factor, both in increasing the risk of crashes and the severity. Certain high crash risks locations are responsible for a disproportionate number of fatalities and serious injuries. Memphis, unfortunately, was recently rated the third worst city for pedestrian injuries and accidents. Senator Markey and I got the Complete Streets Act passed, and as part of the, got it into the Jobs Act, and so a certain percentage of money has to go toward those projects. How will Complete Streets planning initiatives included in the Jobs Act change the way we design our roadways and prioritize safety and access for all users over speed?
Well, as you correctly point out, speed is a factor in so many of the roadway fatalities that we experience in the U.S. And having an approach to road design that recognizes that not only what's in the car, not only who's in the car, but the road itself and how it's designed can play a major role in safety. We think we have a safety responsibility to support Complete Streets. And indeed, there are a number of provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure law, as you know, that encourage state, tribal, and local governments to develop Complete Streets standards or policies and plans that prioritize Complete Streets projects. I would point also to the economic benefits of that. Certainly was my own experience in my hometown where we applied what you could think of as a Complete Streets treatment to a downtown thoroughfare and saw a lot of benefit to small business from there being more foot traffic because people felt safer walking along the street once it had gone through those upgrades. We have delivered the report to Congress that was called for, called Moving to a Complete Streets Design Model, which offers the Federal Highway Administration's guidance and identifies some of the resources that can be helpful here. We don't aim to prescribe all of the details about what makes for a good complete street. We know that local jurisdictions will come up with their own ideas, but we wanted to provide a framework and provide support. And I would also emphasize, among other funding sources that would be a legitimate application for complete streets. Certainly with the Safe Streets and Roads for All program, which is $1 billion annually over the next 5 years, I think that's one area where a well-considered complete streets plan will score quite well.
Thank you, sir. I just hope that you would concentrate or put specific focus on road corridors that are the most serious problems based on high risk, and of course that would include Memphis, but I know you'll do that. Can I go to lightning rod round here? Passenger rail is important for the people in my city and my state. We'd like to connect Memphis and Nashville. Those are two of the iconic large cities in the South that are not connected while most are. Are there funds that are in the bill that would help Tennessee pursue intercity passenger rail service between Nashville and Memphis?
Certainly, the bill providing for greater investment in passenger rail than we've seen since the inception of Amtrak certainly contains funds where I would expect that anyone with a vision for intercity rail like that will be interested in applying, and we'll be interested to see what.
I hope you'll help. I don't know if you're a fan of country music or not, but country music says there's more songs about leaving Nashville and more songs about going to Memphis than anything else. So it would be an important corridor. Airports are important too. And unfortunately, we do not have a direct flight from Memphis to Nashville any longer because we're no longer a hub city. We applied for an airport grant, and I appreciate your nonpartisanship in giving $5 million to Chattanooga and getting that money out, but it detoured, it didn't get to Memphis. Can you give me some kind of an idea about what Memphis might be able to do to receive a second round funding? Our airport is older. It's in a seismic zone with the Madrid fault and possible earthquake. And we have a very poor population and a low income. Memphis is an ideal city to get help. Can you give me some idea about how Memphis might receive that?
Yes, there are several funds that have become available through the infrastructure law in addition to the ongoing availability of the Airport Improvement Program. And so would certainly welcome applications from those applicants who didn't make it in the last round of the airport terminal program. We've got several more rounds to go, and it was certainly oversubscribed. We'd love to fund as many of those projects as we can, as well as that's where most of the passenger-facing investments would be out of the airport terminal program. But for other improvements from tarmac to apron to runway to tower, there are a lot of additional resources now available thanks to the infrastructure law that could also be areas where they might want to apply.
Thank you. My time's expired, but I want to re-thank you for coming to Memphis when the bridge closed down and for visiting FedEx and for getting part of the underrides bill and implementing it in the bipartisan act. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Representative Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Buttigieg, I've been driving an electric car for 10 years, and I've had solar panels for 15 years, and I'm really bullish on technology and the way it could help make our country energy independent or more energy independent. But I'm really alarmed at sort of the naivete of those who are promoting rapid adoption of these technologies with our existing infrastructure. President Biden signed a non-binding executive order stating that 50% of vehicles sold in the United States should be electric by 2030. Do you support that?
Yes.
And he also said that by 2035 that 100% of the federal government fleet should be electric. Do you support that?
Yes.
So which uses more electricity? We're talking about residential electricity here. A refrigerator when it's running or an electric car when it's charging in your garage?
I would expect a car.
Would you say it uses twice as much or 25 times as much?
I would think closer to 25 times as much. Yeah.
It's actually 50 at the instantaneous moment, but over the course of a year, if I take the numbers from the U.S. Department of Energy about the average household, how many vehicles they own and how far they drive, over the course of a year, an American household would use 25 times as much electricity for their electric car as they would for their refrigerator if they had 100% adoption. And the average family has 2 vehicles, and this would be if the average family had 2 electric vehicles. Do you think it would strain the grid if everybody plugged in 25 refrigerators in every household?
Well, if we didn't make any upgrades to the grid, sure. I mean, if we had yesterday's grid with tomorrow's cars, it's not going to work. It's one of the reasons why we believe that infrastructure includes electrical infrastructure and argued for that to be included, as it thankfully was in the bipartisan law.
Do you think by 2030, which is when Biden says 50% of cars sold should be electric, do you think the grid will be capable of handling electric cars?
It's going to need to be, and we're working with the Department of Energy every day. We've established a joint office of energy and transportation to map out some of the needs. Obviously, some of this gets outside of my lane, and we've been discussing with, for example, the truck stops that are looking at what their power needs would need to be at an interchange where today they're mainly filling up on gas in order to accommodate that. And then, as you mentioned, a lot of the scenario for this is also residential. But it's also worth pointing out that while a typical driver who adopts electric is using more electricity, at the end of the day, they're using less energy because of the efficiency benefits of getting that energy produced at utility
The problem
scale
is,
instead of
we
burning
don't have the
fuels in your car.
capacity to produce that energy. You aptly use the word need. You could say want as well. There's needs and wants to make this fantasy work by 2030, but the reality is the capability is not going to be there. The average household uses 17% of their electricity for air conditioning. And that would mean the average household uses 1,870 kilowatt hours per year for air conditioning. If that average household plugged in electric cars, do you know how much more electricity they would use in comparison to the air conditioning that air conditions their whole house?
No, but again, I would emphasize it will
Well, let me
be
help you.
less
Let me help
energy
you with
overall.
that first before we go on, because the numbers are important. It would take 4 times as much electricity to charge the average household's cars as the average household uses on air conditioning. Do you think that could be? So if we reach the goal by 2030 that Biden has of 50% adoption instead of 100% adoption, that means the average household would use twice as much electricity charging one of their cars as they would use for all of the air conditioning that they use for the entire year. Do you think this could contribute to rolling blackouts and brownouts in areas of the country where air conditioning is basically considered essential?
Not if we prepare. Look, the fact that people who have electric vehicles are going to use more electricity can't be a reason to give up. The idea that America is inferior to the other countries that have figured this out just doesn't sit well with us in administration, and
I'm
that's
not
why we're
saying-
investing in a better grid.
In the time that I have left, let me say, I'm not saying we shouldn't prepare. I told you at the beginning of this, I'm bullish on this technology, but the numbers and the rate of adoption has been developed using political science, not engineering. They're impractical, and if we blindly follow these goals that Biden has set out, it will cause pain and suffering for the middle class. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Johnson. Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and good to see you, Secretary Buttigieg. Thank you for your time and your testimony. For decades, communities of color and low-income communities have been ill-served by our transportation system. Our communities face a higher burden of pollution and fewer affordable, safe transportation options. One means to address this is to build more high-quality transit lines, such as the Atlanta Area Transit Agency, MARTA's proposal for the South Lake Bus Rapid Transit Project, which will serve an area made up of 93% minority individuals. The South Lake BRT project is in the pipeline for the Federal Capital Investment Grants Program. The Federal Transit Administration is currently developing new guidance for the SIG program, which will significantly influence which projects qualify and receive funding in the future. Mr. Secretary, how will your department ensure this new guidance and the SIG program generally will support equity and deliver real results for underserved communities?
We're certainly committed to considering equity and other important criteria that belong within the framework of our transit policy. And when it comes to CIG, which is among the largest competitive federal grant programs, we recognize there's a lot at stake. The President's budget requests $2.9 billion in general funds for CIG, and additional funds in the amount of $1.6 billion are provided through the advance appropriations that came in the IIJA. So that's a total of $4.5 billion to work with. This is also a program that requires projects to go through an extensive process to ensure that they are going to effectively use those taxpayer dollars. And the evaluation criteria include things like consideration of affordable housing in the transit corridor, credit for projects that serve transit-dependent populations, and incentives to use alternative fuel vehicles and build environmentally friendly facilities. So you have my commitment that as we continue with the process of updating the CIG program regulation to make sure that the guidance reflects the changes that came by way of the infrastructure law, and the initial changes are out for notice and comment. We'll continue to consider these and other important values and criteria to the extent that the law provides for us to do so.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, the House recently passed an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that I authored, which relates to the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program applicable to highway, transit, and safety programs. The amendment eliminates the gross receipts cap in effect for DBEs working on surface transportation projects. This amendment ensures that the definition of a DBE is consistent across DOT programs as it brings surface transportation online, in line with how the FAA defines a DBE and ensures that DOT follows SBA definitions for a small business. Do you support the elimination of the gross receipts cap for surface transportation programs? And also, what additional steps in your department is your department taking to promote maximum participation by DBEs in DOT programs?
Well, first of all, yes, we support that step. We recognize that the SBA's government-wide small business size standards are more accurate and consistent in terms of measuring a small business. And so we think this can address something that we hear very often as a concern from DBE owners who, as one business leader put it to me, feel that they are sometimes viewed in such a way that they become too small to be big and too big to be small. And we are within days of publishing our own notice of proposed rulemaking with a number of updates and amendments to our program rules to modernize and improve the DBE program. We want it to be more user-friendly while maintaining the highest standards of program integrity. And look forward to getting public comment on that proposed rule as soon as it's out. I'll also say, in addition to the formal requirements and rules pursuant to the program, we're also just doing a lot of engagement and communication, making sure the DBE community knows about the opportunities that are coming and understands where to go in order to become more involved. And we'll be engaging the incumbent and larger firms as well about what we consider to be the importance of them being good partners with these smaller and disadvantaged companies too.
Thank you. Now I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Representative Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thanks for being here. I'm sure you know, folks, where I live, my bosses, my constituents are paying about 80% more for gasoline than they were when President Biden became the president. And I think the response, I mean, I think it's fair to say that even you have implied that they should buy an electric vehicle and absolve themselves of that 80% increase per gallon. Just looking at Kelley Blue Book, the price of a EV is about $55,000. Now, that doesn't include, so it's actually more than that because there's $7,500 per car subsidy paid for by about $48 billion in taxes on the same people on that car. So it's closer to about $60,000. There's about $20,000 more than a gas-driven passenger car, about $40,000 more than the average compact car. At the same time, I'm sure you probably also realize that the average Pennsylvanian pays about $170 a month in electricity, and that doesn't include the 10 to 15% that has just gone up. So that's an old number, so it's actually more than that. And based on Mr. Massey's numbers, which I don't doubt at all, if they could afford the electric vehicle and plug it in, we're talking about another $90, $100 a month in electric costs. I'm wondering what the administration and you are doing other than subsidizing, to lower the cost. Look, they're either paying more for gas, 80%, or they're paying more for electricity to the tune of essentially doubling their electricity bill. Like, how's this getting better for my bosses? And what's the administration like? What do you plan to do about that cost other than subsidies?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm very glad you asked that question. First of all, I want to be clear. nobody I know, certainly not me, thinks that all or even most Americans can easily afford electric vehicles. That said, I'm struck by this $55,000 number that keeps going around. I knew this might come up, so I just pulled a few of the latest prices. A Chevy Bolt, so an American-made 2022 EV is $26,595. If you want a pickup truck, like a Chevy Silverado EV or Ford F-150 Lightning, the starting prices of those are $39,900 and $39,974 respectively. We've also begun to see...
Is that pre-subsidy or post-subsidy?
I think it depends on which, it depends on the automaker, because some of them have gone through the cap for the 7,500, and some
Does
of them
that
have
include
not.
state subsidies as well?
I don't think so, no.
Okay.
So, and look, that's the new car. So the first time I got a plug-in car, for example, Chasten and I got one. It was $14,000. Had about 15,000 miles on it. It was a C-Max. So it was a combo plug-in hybrid. But what we're seeing in terms of the dynamics now is we're close to the point, and may actually be there on certain models and under certain circumstances, where the extent to which your car payment would go up is actually already outweighed by the extent to which your gas bill would go down, even factoring in the cost of electricity. Now, again, that depends on what electricity
So you're
market
saying the
you're in.
market's bringing it down. Look, I got my numbers from Kelley Blue Book, so...
Are those this year's numbers?
What's that?
Would those be this year's numbers?
Actually, last year, but I don't know that anything, especially used cars, have actually gone down in price. But my other concern is that I'm sure, if you're not aware, that you should be aware that about since 2010, so it's essentially over 12 years now, we've closed over 550 power generation stations, which is about 102 gigawatts, and we're scheduled to retire another by 2025, so just a couple of years, 17 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity. At the same time, we're asking Americans through subsidies and through their purchases to pay for China, who has, I think you wouldn't argue, 80 to 90% market share of everything that goes into an electric vehicle. Right, into an electric vehicle. At the same time, we're essentially reducing power, and using Thomas's numbers, which I think are correct, we're going to increase the grid requirement by at least 50%, which none of that really works out. You look at a country like Ghana, who's shutting the lights off now because they followed this model that we're following right now. What's the administration and what are you doing to make it easier and more affordable to mine critical minerals in the United States to support this industry?
One thing we've been working on with the Department of Energy is better sourcing of some of the elements that go into batteries, for example, ideally in the United States, and if not in the United States, then in geopolitically friendlier territory. Now, some of this isn't just the mining, right? Some of it's actually the refining capacity, which is to China's advantage, and we got to change that. I guess our view is we shouldn't accept that as a given.
Yeah, China refines 90% of the manganese. Are we going to bring that to the United States?
We'd love to bring that
we're over
the
time.
refinement capacity more to U.S. and friendly countries.
Okay, thank you. I ran out of time. At this point, I'll ask questions, and Rodney Davis will ask questions, and then we're going to recess for votes. Mr. Secretary, I just want to clarify the issue of the guidance, which caused a bit of a stir when you issued the guidance on building a better America, as we called it, Fix It First, in the legislation that passed out of the House. And let's just get straight on the record. Who makes the decision how to invest apportioned highway dollars? Is it the feds or the state DOTs?
It's up to the state DOTs.
Okay. Does anything in their guidance change that?
No.
Okay. Have you proposed to eliminate eligibility for certain types of highway construction projects?
No.
Does DOT propose to take away formula or discretionary money from states who add new highway lane capacity?
No.
Are you forcing any states to build transit or active transportation projects over highway projects?
Forcing? No.
Okay. I do remember your memorable exchange when Ms. Capito, former member of this committee, asked you before the Senate why you were doing this, and you said, "Oh man, because it's good policy." which I support. We want people just to think these things through. It's not a mandate, but think about it as you move forward, instead of doing the same thing again and again and again, which doesn't work. We induce more demand, we build more lane miles, we induce more demand, we build more lane miles, and we end up with the same congestion in the end. And then secondly, there's been some controversy about your proposed rulemaking on tracking greenhouse gas emissions from on-road sources. Now, I remember the day when states were allowed to set negative safety targets. Now you have performance management rules in areas such as asset management, bridge and pavement conditions, and safety. Has requiring states to set targets and measure their own progress toward these desirable goals helped focus attention and investment?
We think it has. I would describe that as good policy, too.
Okay. Then just on, the exchange about EVs and that, I don't know what we're going to do with all the mechanics, and that's something we have to start thinking about. But the life cycle cost of an EV is significantly less than a fossil-fueled vehicle. When it was penciled out for the post office, unfortunately, the current Postmaster General doesn't agree. They would have saved a phenomenal amount of money, even though there was more upfront cost if they had moved to an EV fleet. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account. So I thank you. I thank you for your testimony, and now I turn to Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Secretary, great to see you again. It was great seeing you at DCA last week and had a chance to chat with you there. I wish I'd have seen you when Congressman Boss and I were on our never-ending journey to try and get out of LaGuardia last night, but we didn't get a chance to do that. But it's always good to talk transportation, and we appreciate you being here today. I would mention, I was going to ask you about the policy on using bipartisan infrastructure law resources to build a better America that Chairman Testifies asked you about. I hope you were pretty clear in your response to him. I hope that clarification is given to our states because there's still some confusion. We have them reaching out to us, wondering what your intention was. So thank you for that clarification. But moving that out to the states would be beneficial too. IJA also includes my provision I helped craft here in the House, the One Federal Decision Act, and that would streamline federal environmental reviews, as you know. I've talked to Mayor Landrieu about this. Many of my colleagues are worried about getting those dollars out the door. You can't do that without streamlining the review process. What's going on there, the deadlines, including for consulting agencies regarding categorical exclusions. Can you please update me on implementing One Federal Decision?
Thanks. Yeah, we recognize the importance of a swift and prompt process as things are going through, especially federal requirements on permitting. And as the earlier exchange highlighted, that's even more important in an environment with inflation adding to the consequence of things taking any longer than they have to. With regard to the consulting that you mentioned, our department got to work right away on that. It effectively allows one department to engage in other departments' categorical exclusions when they qualify. So as called for in the legislation, DOT completed a review of our categorical exclusions. We found 4 areas where we could collaborate with other departments, accelerating the process on projects, especially that are helpful with things like post-disaster resilience. And that's, of course, just one of the requirements pursuant to the One Federal Decision provisions in the law. We are committed to making sure that we address all of them.
Sure. I would envision if the majority changes here in the House, any legislation that is passed into law would likely have more environmental review provisions like One Federal Decision. So implementing it with IJA now could be a barometer in how you do it in the future too. Mr. Secretary, Amtrak has laid out some ambitious goals. Last year, it released a Connect US plan that outlined a 15-year strategy for expansion that would, according to it, connect dozens of city pairs. Of the corridors mentioned in its 15-year strategy, are you aware that any are ready to move forward and be put into action?
So if I'm recalling correctly, the corridors are laid out in such a way that some of them are an expansion of service on existing physically constructed lines. Others would require more work. I don't have handy the timeline of which could be ready by when, but my understanding is it's a mix of things that could be done relatively quickly and things that would take more extensive work.
So when you say relatively quickly, has Amtrak or anyone at your agency done any environmental reviews for some of these proposed routes?
So depending on the route, we'd have to see if it would qualify. I think often it could qualify for a CE because it'd be along existing right-of-way, but I don't know that we have gotten as far as any new right-of-way being proposed and ready for an EIS or something like that.
So if you don't have new right-of-way, you probably haven't reached any agreements with landowners on any of the proposals?
I haven't seen it advance to that level yet.
If you have, will you get back to, have your team get back to us? Sure. Also, I know you get lots of letters of support for the RAISE grants. Clearly, I know you think mine are the best. So I want to just remind you of a couple that I've sent to your agency. The city of Decatur and Macon County has a Brush College Road and Ferries Parkway project. Springfield, high-speed rail project between Chicago and St. Louis. Springfield has done a great job in leveraging federal resources to actually combine two tracks into one in and around Springfield. They have two more usable segments, one RAISE grant and one MPDG grant application. Terminal Rail Association of St. Louis with the multimodal freight yard expansion in Venice, McLean County, Route 66, bike and pedestrian trail, and in Edwardsville, we have the Goshen Road and Liberty Trail multimodal transportation improvement projects. I will get you a list of those so you don't have to write them down. I'd appreciate your consideration and any updates. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Since we have votes on the floor of the House, the committee shall stand in recess, and we will return and start again as quickly as possible.